Alright, welcome everyone to a new live stream. I'm your host, how unexpectedly, Coach Robert, and I have a new topic today, which is the Maroczy Bind pawn structure. And we're going to be following some examples from the game, not the games of, but the book by Andy Soltis with the same title, Pawn Structure Chess. So he has a chapter dedicated to this Maroczy Bind, and it's a really relevant pawn structure that happens in a variety of ways. I might do a follow-up video where I show some examples of modern ways of getting this pawn structure. This book by Soltis is from like several decades ago. It's like before computers were popular and strong. So the examples are old, and therefore the lines are not necessarily contemporary, but they're really good for illustrating the basic concepts, which is the goal of my video today. So why don't we just jump into it, I suppose. Oops. This is the pawn structure that's associated with the Maroczy Bind. And you might wonder, like, why is it called that? And why do you say Maroczy instead of Maroczy? Well, Maroczy was a player who popularized this at some point. And I think they were Hungarian, and I believe in Hungarian you pronounce this Maroczy as Maroczy. So that's definitely the accurate pronunciation. But more importantly, this is the structure that's named after that player, Maroczy. And it's pretty common. You've probably already seen this before if you've been playing chess for a little while now. The distinctive features are that, first of all, a pair of pawns have been traded. In this case, it's the missing C pawn and the D pawn. I still kind of consider it a Maroczy Bind if it's E and C, but the strategies are quite different. They're similar, but this is the true Maroczy Bind where there's no C pawn for one side, no D pawn for the other, and the side that is missing the center pawn is going to clamp down on the light squares by playing C4 and E4. In this case, you can also get a color reversed version of this, with black having no D pawn and pawns on E5 and C5. It's strategically the same. So you might have heard people say, like, don't put your pawns all in one color. I know I've definitely said that to people before. Just as an example of this more basic idea, I've seen a lot of beginner games start like this. This is not related to the Maroczy Bind. This is just kind of bonus material. And they'll play D3, which is a fine move. But then they'll play B3 next. And this is usually where you get that criticism that you shouldn't put all of your pawns on one color. And the reason for that, in general terms, is that in order to avoid losing this bishop, you're going to have to make some kind of concession. In fact, if black wants to trade a knight for this bishop, they can basically whenever they want, because now there's no way for you to move this bishop without either getting captured by a knight or after a move like a6 getting captured by a pawn. So you see there's already problems here. And usually when I'm playing against a student and they play like this, I won't say anything and I'll just like quietly overprotect e5, play knight e7, play c6, and then trap the bishop with b5. So this is where you usually see that kind of criticism. But coming back to what we're actually talking about, this Maroczy Bind, you might be wondering, like, why is it okay to put these pawns on light squares? And you might even have to put more pawns on light squares later to support them. So what's the deal with that? Well, something about this position has already been determined. It's that because we've traded the C and D pawns, black has more or less one thing they would really like to do if they wanted to be able to equalize in terms of space. And if anyone's watching the replay or in the chat, you might want to pause or just type in what you think black would want to play. Just imagine there's more pieces on the board, and maybe they want to liberate their position somehow. They want to make room for their pieces. They want to dismantle white center. The typical move would be d5, but when you play this Maroczy Bind structure, d5 is no longer safe in almost any position. You can easily imagine how if you had to play e6 to prepare d5, the d6 pawn will be weak. Like, you could attack it with heavy pieces like a rook on d1 or on d2. That kind of thing. And even if you finally get through your d5 break, this would allow white to open lines. So part of why I chose to cover this pawn structure rather than any of the other ones that are mentioned in this great book by Soltis is I think the Maroczy Bind is pretty easy to play for white, and it offers chances of a pretty significant advantage. It's practically quite difficult for black, even if their position is equal according to computer analysis. So, let's see some examples. The examples I picked are from Soltis' book, but I'm not following Soltis' annotations necessarily. In fact, I haven't even picked up this book in years. I just remember it well from a few years ago. I really liked the book, but I don't remember the exact annotations he gave. I just remember the broad strokes. So, this time we're looking at in English. This game is Botvinnik versus Golombek. And here we're seeing a double fianchetto, which is an interesting way of approaching the symmetrical variation. It's symmetrical variation whenever black plays c5 against c4. And one of the concepts behind fianchettoing this bishop here instead of completing your kingside development is you want to eliminate this bishop on g7 at some point. That can give you some attacking chances. So it's just one idea. But another idea is related to attaining this Maroczy Bind structure. So even though black has tried to stake their claim for the d4 square, here we get to play d4 anyway because of the support from this bishop. So they took back. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I have the chat pulled up. Queen c8 was an interesting decision by Golombek. Now here, if you remember this first diagram, or I could show you again. So this is the pawn structure. If we do the flip book thing where I like go back and forth real quick, you'll see there's a difference in the pawn structure. Right, if you just look at the pawns. First of all, g3 is in play, so you might have noticed that difference. But that's probably not a terribly important difference here. I mean, it's important because, like, if you don't play g3 and bishop g2, your bishop has to be on either e2 or d3, and we'll see some examples like that. But in terms of obtaining the Maroczy pawn structure, you'll notice that e4 is not played yet. So if we're going for the structure, should we just play e4 right away, or should we play some preparatory moves? I think this is always a relevant question, and the way that you answer questions like this is by checking yourself whether or not you understand what the strategic goals are. Otherwise, you could just like blindly play e4 and c4 at the start of the game, and you'll probably be really disappointed that you didn't get a bind in that situation. Now here the pawn structure is already ready for it because they played c takes d4. So you would definitely get the structure you want. But part of why we're playing c4 and e4 against this pawn structure is we want to not just prevent d5, so you should always, I guess, check to see if they can play d5 anyway when you play the structure. But you're also playing for a space advantage. And if you guys are not sure about the strategic elements of a space advantage, you can check out my other live stream recording where I talk about space. I think it's called like staking your territory or going too far, that kind of thing. Just search space on my channel, you'll find it. Anyway, so here I would not play e4 right away, because if I want to maximize my space advantage, I would probably want to avoid trading these pieces. And this is just on principle, like no calculation behind it. Here they could probably take. And there's also a tactical aspect as well here. So here you might want to switch sides in your head and answer black to play. What would black do if it was their move? Alright, so you might have noticed by now that the bishop is looking at all these pieces. And this is one of the reasons that people even bother to accept playing the black side of Maroczy pawn structure. They get this really active bishop. And here, you can take advantage of that by playing knight takes e4. And sometimes when you play a move like this, you need to be careful about queen takes g7 because there might be some kind of amazing tactics here. But usually those tactics depend on there being a knight on d4. For example, it might be like a queen on e5, and they'll play queen takes, king takes, and then the knight on d4 goes to like f5, king g8, and then knight h6. You can probably imagine a checkmate with a bishop and a knight in that position. I can even play it out if I'm a little bit tricky. Here, let me try to be tricky. I'm just gonna make some contrived moves here. Don't mind me. And then, how do I make this better? Because I need to make it black to play. Hold on. I'm going to use the other rook. Alright, there we go. So this is the kind of position that I'm talking about, where like you sack, you give a double check, and then you give mate. So this kind of thing you have to look out for when you're calculating tactics like these. But not in this situation. Here, after knight takes e4, it's all pretty simple for black, I would say. Everything's protected. So e4 is actually a tactical blunder here, but it's also on principle that you should play knight c2, because black wants to alleviate their space problems by trading pieces. So if you can avoid it, that's pretty good. You also, so you might be thinking therefore that they could have just traded knights earlier in the game, right? So why not just do that? Well, here they can't do it because the rook's hanging on a8. And here they couldn't do it either. So in this game you actually couldn't tactically, but in some positions, even if they can take on d4, and I think we'll see one like that today. Depends on how much time we have. Even if they can trade, sometimes it leads to white having a powerful initiative. So there are a lot of tricky things about playing the black side of this structure. I think black should actually avoid playing against the Maroczy bind, lay as much as they can, unless they have some special way of immediately breaking it, which we'll talk about. But first, let's see this example of white executing the Maroczy bind. So now we have our structure. And black is maneuvering their knights for some unknown purpose so far. You might imagine that maybe they're trying to activate this bishop. That makes a lot of sense. So how should we proceed to complete our development here for white is the next question. So if you're watching live, feel free to give your feedback. And if you're watching the recording, you might want to pause and just ask yourself, like, how will white complete development here? They got the pawn structure, but that doesn't mean that your work is done. There are more things to do. Hello, Shai. Welcome to the chat. Right now we're looking at a position that's white to play. And we're just wondering how we'll complete our development. So maybe pick a move to play right now and the next couple of moves that you plan. Queen f4 is a very ambitious move, Shai. I think queen f3 is what you were going for, but yeah, queen f3 seems kind of interesting. But if I play queen f3, I think at some point they'll play knight c e5, and that could be a little uncomfortable. Or maybe they could force trade pieces, because we were just talking about how maybe that's something that we want to do. After queen f3, we might play knight d4. And then after knight takes, bishop takes, white's probably still slightly better, but it's maybe also a tiny gain for black. F4 is another interesting idea, because in this structure, one of the long-term ways that you develop your position is by gaining space, like even more space, which is something I talked about in my video about space strategy. So here after f4, you might continue with f5 and even press on to f6 if you're able to. But just staying on f4 is pretty good, because you are restricting the black pieces. And you can improve your pieces a little bit more before you finally look for some kind of breakthrough. But yeah, f4 is pretty great. But it might be a good idea to try to develop your pieces a little bit more before you go for it. f4 could lead to a dark square weakness. That's also true. In the game, they played queen d2. And here, black continued with knight c5. And then f4 finally came. Now here they played knight e6, and it turns out this is a pretty major error. So I need to get up for just 1 minute, but I want you guys to think about what white should play here. I'll be right back. Sorry guys, sometimes I don't feel so hot in the morning. Mr. Soup and Bread, you want to play f5? Okay. Let me see. Luis wanted knight d5, but it looks like a mistake because of bishop on b2 hanging. Okay. Bishop h3 pinning the knight to the queen. That's an interesting idea as well. Oh, and then f5. Okay, so I think I see your whole idea. I guess since you guys are all maybe liking bishop h3, we could take a look at that quickly. So let's just imagine it first. So it's pinning the queen. I guess the next thing that comes to my mind is they could either play f5 or they could play like queen b8 or queen e8. I'd be inclined for queen b8, I guess. So Luis would play rook b1. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. If you really, really want to play knight d5, you could play rook b1. But let's evaluate this idea. It's kind of interesting. First thing I would check is f5. And the reason I would check f5 first is this is an attempt to dismantle the pawn structure for white, as well as defending against the idea of bishop takes e6. But I'm also not convinced that queen b8 isn't good, because when you play bishop h3, it's kind of saying to me that you want to capture on e6. And if you do it immediately, I think that this is actually an improvement for black, because now they have hopes of breaking with d5, or at the very least they stop a piece from coming on d5. Unless you have some tactical justification. And they also can put pressure on f4. So there's a bunch of good things about this position. I'm interested to see if there's a problem with f5. Like e6 could be a little loose, so maybe you would continue with a move like rook a e1. But I think this allows black to go ahead and trade some pieces. Not that that's bad. Maybe it's even for the better. Actually, I see something here, so maybe we could take... Well, this one's check. I was thinking that if you take, then they could maybe play... Oh, there's another tactical thing here. So if you take, there could be a knight f3. Well, it looks like black's getting a lot of counterplay. So So f5 seems pretty enticing. At least as a first instinct. Knight d8 could be possible. But I'm not sure I would want to play knight d8. I'm guessing, Shai, that you meant this knight to d8. But at the very least, you could play f5 in this situation. So I don't think knight d8 is that good. And the reason I want f5 is to activate white's pieces. I want to try to open some lines to their king, now that I have more space. So in the game, Botvinnik played rook a d1, which partly copes with the difficulty that in Luis's line, the rook was hanging on a1. By the way, sorry I had to get up for so long. Sometimes I don't feel so well in the morning these days. But anyway, so rook a d1. And in this position, we can see why black chose this maneuver to bring the knight to e6. They played knight d4, trying very hard to trade pieces with less space. And after knight takes, it's white to play and get an advantageous position. Thanks, Luis. Also, it's good to see Luis in the chat. Like we used to always stream together, and sometimes it's hard for us to catch up. So always a pleasure to see you guys joining in for the stream. I think this game is kind of a funny choice for the first introduction to the Maroczy Bind, because I think a lot of the time when people choose a game that highlights a strategic concept, they show like a grinding kind of game where you set up the idea, and then the rest is just like maneuvering and stopping your opponent from doing what they want to do, and then eventually you beat them in the end game or something, like in the Capablanca's Greatest Chess Endings, for example. But here, this game ends tactically, and Mr. Soup and Bread has it. It's knight d5. And this might not look like a tactical position exactly, but you can see that the move knight d5 really sharpens the play. First of all, we have a threat, right? It's coming up. They have to deal with this threat. But we also have the threat of taking this knight on d4. So they only have one move that makes any sense. And this is why you might think, this is not so tactical, because they can just take the knight. But it's not that simple, it turns out. Here the knight's still hanging, and they only have one move. They have to play knight b5. And here in 2 moves black resigned. So see if you guys can find the sequence that white played here. It's a simple sequence. Nothing too flashy, just taking advantage of black's poor coordination. So this knight's very badly placed. It can only go to c7. Well, sort of. I mean, it could come onto c3 or something, but I think the position's going to change rapidly and they won't get a chance. If you're using the 3 questions from Ogard, like in the video that I made on that topic, you might ask yourself, like, what's the worst placed piece? What are the tactical targets or weaknesses? What's the opponent's idea? Let's see. So Luis says rook c1 must be played to avoid queen c5 and stop knight c3. Okay, that's interesting. So I'm wondering if queen c5 is such a big deal. I guess it depends on what you play first. Okay, so Luis is suggesting rook c1 on the first move, I suppose. And Shai agrees. So let's say we play rook c1 now. I'll just play it on the board. Black will probably move their queen, right? Yeah, they have to move their queen, I think. Maybe they would choose d7 because that looks pretty safe. I think safety is the main concern here, but I don't really want to move on the 8th rank unless I have to, because I want to connect the rooks, play like rook c1 and trade pieces after. So here, how are we going to follow up? Shriram always has class. Come on, Shriram. But Shriram never fails to join in the chat and tell us that he has class. Yeah, Luis, I think your tactical intuition's right. We want to somehow make the knight and the queen line up. So if we play rook c1, we're actually forcing them to improve the position of their queen. So Mr. Soup and Bread and Luis are on the right track. So if we go with Luis's move, bishop takes g7, we have 2 things to analyze here. One, if they play queen c5 check, and the other if they play king g7. So let's first examine this, and then we'll see queen c5 check. So king takes g7, and then a4. And here they resign. This was the main line. I'm sorry, not a4 here, but rook c1 first. So we're combining all the ideas. Yeah, so rook c1, and here they resigned because whatever move they play, we're playing a4. Yeah, and no matter what they play, they're going to lose a piece. Like, if they play knight a3, first of all, that's a terrible place to put your knight, but then there's queen b2 check, which wins the knight. If they play knight c7, which is probably what... They probably did a little hand-waving earlier in their calculation and figured, hey, I could put the knight here in an emergency. But here there's queen c3, and now there's two pieces attacking the knight, so they're losing a piece. So this brings us to, there's one more line. What if they play queen c5 check? But I don't think this is really a troubling... Luis messed up the move order. I thought I just misread your variation. I figured you got it. So there's king h1 here, and I think that they have to take this bishop, right? It's not like you can trap the bishop on g7. And now after rook c1... I just noticed queen d4. Okay, maybe not rook c1. Let's just think about this for a second. Oh yeah, I remember what I was going for here. So a4. And if they play knight c7, this is very similar. We just are skewering the queen and the knight, and it's really funny that they don't have any place to protect the knight with the queen because of the pawn structure. So they might choose, for instance, knight c3. If they choose knight a3, their knight is so terrible, like it's just trapped there. It's not going to come out. So we might start with like rook c1, and then go trap the knight after that. But if they play knight c3, we can toss in rook c1, and they can give more support, sure, but we can bring more attackers as well. And I think this is it. Hold on. This blocks e4. It's probably maybe simpler to play rook c2. But is knight e4 actually a problem? Knight e4, rook c7, knight d2, rook c8, and then... Yeah, I don't want to allow knight e4. So probably I would play rook c2. Bishop d4 is also an interesting move. I guess you just stay up a piece here, because after knight takes, you play queen takes. So yeah, I think this is probably the simplest solution. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right. Okay, so this was how the game ended, and this is kind of interesting, because I don't think white did anything spectacular here. To recap, they set up this Maroczy Bind, and they got this with an English move order. I'll show the whole thing again really quickly. So they played symmetrical English, and they fianchettoed their queenside bishop in order to support the d4 break. Notice that they didn't waste any time on e3. This is something that people often do in the English as well, where they'll play e3 and then d4. But that's a different structure. It doesn't have as much of that like clampy potential as playing c4 followed by e4. And white dodged this tactic with knight takes d4 before they set up the structure. It looks like I missed something with queen b2. Let me see about that. Yeah, so, and then black started maneuvering to try to improve their minor pieces by trading off one of them. But it ended up just leaving their pieces all like hanging and in difficulties because they lack squares to go to. And this isn't coincidence, this is because of the space advantage that white has here. So there was a tactical moment and everything kind of crumbled. So I think Luis was talking about in this line with queen c5 check, where I was calculating knight c3 and rook f3. He was saying that instead just play queen b2, which is pinning everything. But I wonder, because this doesn't add more more attackers, so maybe I could get away with something here. Like queen b4 and step out of one of the pins. And then you play rook f3. So maybe I would play queen d4 to defend here. I think that you're still winning, but it at least makes it a little bit tricky. Let me just check something real quick. My idea is that if you play rook f3, I'm going to play knight b5 to escape. But I think you can play rook d1. And my idea here is that after queen f6, you throw e5. And that's it. Oh, wait, hold on. After e5, there's knight takes d1. No, pawn takes f6 is check. Yeah, this makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I think white's winning here too. So yeah, that's probably a good call. Queen b2. Alright, let's look at another game. And this one is also in a symmetrical English. But Portisch deployed the Maroczy Bind much more quickly against Reshevsky. And here Reshevsky tried to trade pieces quickly. I get the feeling that Reshevsky always would try to trade a pair of minor pieces as black in this structure. Planet Chess Club, good to see you in the chat. Welcome. We need to get together and do a co-op stream at some point. We haven't fleshed out the details yet, but you know we were working on it a little bit for a minute there. So just showing some opening moves here. And I think this is something that's important to observe here. I think a lot of people are adverse to the idea of moving the same piece multiple times in the opening, but here it doesn't make a difference. You're ready? All right, that's great. We should definitely message afterwards about this. This coming week, I'm attending the AGU conference, so I might be a little bit like here and there, but we should definitely set up a call or something, maybe in the next week. Okay, so this is a nice idea, queen d2, and you're not really losing time by moving your queen again in this situation, because if you think about it, black moved their knight multiple times to make you bring out your queen in one move, so you're kind of just returning the favor, but what you get in return for your time investment is the security of your queen, and also this has a concrete plan associated with it, which is to play bishop h6. Luis, you don't like it? The queen d2 move? Let's see, what else could we play here then? Like f3 comes to mind, bishop e2. Just not bishop d3, I don't think. I mean, maybe bishop d3, but that seems a little unnecessary. I don't think there's knight d5 here. Could there be? We have to look out for some queen a5 check as well. Like our bishop's hanging. Well, no, in most positions you can play bishop d2. Yeah, we could always come back to this if you think there's something better to play here. I guess I'm not that familiar with the alternatives. Queen d2 seems fine to me, because you're just setting up your position, you know. A lot of the time people who play the Maroczy Bind, they find it very simple, like they can quickly play all the moves because it's usually quite similar in the beginning. You're just stopping all of black's breaks, which is something I meant to mention. So in the last game we saw what happens when white just kind of like gets the structure and black doesn't do anything special. At some point white's going to have a lot of space and it'll be hard for black to coordinate their pieces. So what should black be playing for, right? So one of them is obviously the d5 break, because we mentioned that. But the d5 break is really difficult because c4 and e4 both stop it. So there's some other peripheral breaks where people will play b5 or f5. And sometimes they'll just cope with the weak d pawn and play e5. So a lot of white's early play is just about like getting your pieces out to good squares, you know, intuitively good squares, while preventing all of these moves. So bishop d3, you know, d5 still not possible. because we have such good control of b5. b5's not possible. Black is really far away from getting f5 in, but bishop d3 is also directed against playing f5 in the future, so it's kind of good. Now a5 is an interesting move, maybe a dubious move, and the idea behind a5 is to get some compensatory space on the queen side, but we'll see in this game that it just didn't work. So a5 and then white castled kingside. I think white almost never castles queenside in the Maroczy Bind, because that just gives some potential counterplay to black. And our main goal is to gain space. We're not looking for like a devastating checkmating attack necessarily. And here white played a4, and I think that Soltis marked this with a question mark, saying this was a blunder. Might be a harsh assessment, but I think based on how the game went, it kind of made sense. b5 looks good. Where? Oh, like b5 is an outpost square for white. Yeah, this is a really nice thing. So probably when they play a5, this is giving white some really long-term potential in the endgame. In fact, anytime I see like a6 and b7 or a5 and b7, like this kind of pawn structure where it's just two pawns and any advance of either pawn leaves weaknesses behind, I really like the idea of going to the endgame here. So they played a4, and let me see if this is a good moment for us. Maybe we could try guessing the move. So what should white play here after a4? You know, a4 is such a big mistake, but I don't think it's like a tactical mistake. We have to just choose how to set up our pieces here. So one of the things we have to decide is where do we put our rooks. This is one of the harder questions when in the opening, in any opening. Which rook and where? So one of the ways that you have to decide where to put the rooks is based on the open files or the half-open files. But another question has to do with the pawn breaks, and so in that sense, the Maroczy Bind might require a little bit of subtlety of understanding, because why would you play, for example, rook f to d1 if you want to play f4 and f5 later? The rook would be better on f1. So you have to kind of plan what you want to do with your pawns as well when you are choosing which file to put your rook on. You don't really want to like put it on c1 and then on e1 and then back on d1. You know, wasting time like that's not good. Alright, so Luis says he would like to play a3 and fix the weakness, but that could lead to weakness on b3. I agree, because black might try to get in queen b6 and take advantage of the b3 weakness if you play a3. Also, rook lift is not totally out of the question. I don't think it's possible right now, but depending on how white develops further, especially if trades occur, we might see some rook a6, rook b6 type stuff later. So rook ac1 was their choice. Alright, Shai, thanks for the future feedback. So rook c1 happened, and part of this is to overprotect c4. Yeah, Luis picked it right. He said rook on c1 and d1. I don't know if I would immediately put the rook on d1, because I don't know yet if I want to play f4, but at least c1 we can commit to, right? We definitely know we don't want to play rook to d1, because then we don't have a rook on c1, and this rook would have to go to either e1 or stay where it is. I think those are both not as effective as bringing this one to d1. So since this one we've kind of like identified that we don't want to leave it on a1, we don't want it on b1, and we probably don't want to take away options from the rook on f1, we'll play rook c1. I think this is an instance of beginner logic actually holding for a change. A lot of the time people will put the closest rook to the place where they want to have a rook when they're just starting out. They're like, this rook is on a1, so I want to put a rook on c1, so I'll put that one because it's closer than the one on f1. In this case, that makes sense. So it's intuitive even for people who are just starting out. But it's not always the case that you pick the closer rook. Just a disclaimer. So they chose bishop e6, and now you can see it's nice that we overprotected c4. Not that c4 was in danger, but we're kind of ready to deal with it. I think this next part is what is really tricky. Like, how should white increase the pressure? I don't know if I would necessarily pick the right move here if I didn't already know the course of the game. But that could say more about my style than anything. Maybe it's not hard for example, Luis. The master of the so-called Luis shuffle. Moves his piece in a little triangle, his opponent blunders, he wins. So we just talked about where we could place our other rooks, but we do have other options here. And in this case, I would want to highlight, like, why do you guys think a4 was considered a bad move by Soltis? Aside from, so he considered a4 the bad move, not necessarily a5. a5 creates the b5 outpost, but he said a4 itself is the mistake. Like, didn't criticize a5. Okay, so Luis wants rook d1. Nothing wrong with that. Let's actually see what that would be like. So if we play rook fd1, let me see. Well, how would the play continue here? Maybe I would throw in maybe I would throw in queen a5. No, I don't think queen a5 works. And it's interesting to see why it doesn't work. So after queen a5, they can play the move knight d5. Actually, no. I think it works, actually. Because the queen on a5 is protected by the rook on a8. So here they could just take on d5. But the tactical idea I had was that after queen takes d2, they can play knight takes e7 before they take back on d2. So this is a typical, like, Maroczy Bind tactical idea. Yeah, Luis, you do often pick the most natural move, which could also be partly because you're playing a lot of blitz these days. I don't know. You can tell me what you think about that. You kind of have to play a natural move that's high quality to just not flag. Anyway, I'm still kind of pleased with knight d5. This is probably good enough. So white's position is probably good after rook d1 and queen a5, but maybe after rook d1 they would play queen b6, so that they don't trade as much and can, like, try to put some more pressure on. No, I think queen a5 is probably better. So rook fd1 seems perfectly fine. I think black probably has to make some difficult decisions. But in the game, Portisch played queen c2, which was a nice choice. And the idea is kind of just to take this pawn on a4, and black has to tactically find a way around it. So they played knight d7. And all right, here's a good moment. So what do you guys think? Should we take the pawn on a4 right now, or should we do something else? Yeah, queen c2 is a nice move. Just a little provocative. Like, what are you gonna do, Reshevsky? Your a pawn is weak. This could also be clearing the d file for the future if you play rook d1. So that could also be, like, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't play rook d1 anymore. It could even enhance it. So what do you guys think? Is knight a4 a good idea or no? Rook e1 instead of knight takes a4? Okay. But then what's wrong with snagging the free pawn? Because, I'd like a free pawn. If I could play knight takes a4 and b3, I'd be winning, right? If I could play both moves. With rook e1, since we're clamping on d5, I'm not sure that we would ever actually get to take advantage of the X-ray attack on e7. But still not a bad idea. Well, anyway, after knight takes a4, I think that queen a5 is really something. Because a4 is hanging, g5 is hanging. It looks like a double attack to me. And there might be some way that white can escape with bishop takes e7, but I'm not that sure that that's true. Anyway, that's counterplay. So it's better for white to avoid this counterplay and not take on a4. Even if they can get away with it, it just drastically alters the course of the game, and they lost control. Maroczy Bind is all about maintaining control. Don't let black trade pieces unless it's bad for them. Don't let them break to open lines for their pieces. So white instead played f4, which we've already seen. It's familiar at this point. And black chose to play rook c8 to pressure c4, another tactical way of guarding the a-pawn. So I guess the natural thing is, what happens if we take the a-pawn now? Is it the right time? Well, if you play the move knight takes a4, they can play b5, and they're going to at least get their material back. So knight takes a4 is out. Black's getting counterplay. And if you play queen takes, Luis is suggesting queen to b6. That's an interesting option. I'm not sure if it's the best one, because after queen b6, king h1. Well, I could also play rook f2. No, rook f2 runs into bishop d4. Okay. So king h1. I think your idea was to recover your material, but I think I could throw in rook c2 and then take on e7. So this is maybe too complicated. But after queen takes a4, the move was knight c5. And then you're going to get your material back. Maybe like this. With interest. Okay. So in the game, Portisch played b3, which is a really interesting choice. I think I wouldn't be able to pull the trigger and play b3 myself, because to me this looks like trading off the weakness, but it also is consolidating your queenside pawn structure. Because now, after they trade the weakness, c4 is forever safe. So the queen side is never really going to be an issue for white anymore. Everything's under control. So now after knight f6 and king h1 and queen a5, since everything's under control and all the white pieces are on their best squares, white played f5. Yeah, Luis has good instincts. He would not take the pawn. I mean, I also wouldn't take the pawn, but I think it's important to see why we can't take the pawn, because there is at least one plan where you win, where you play knight a4 and then b3. So if it's possible, I would go for it. But instinctively, I probably would not, most of the time. So here, I want to show the rest of the game, because I'm not feeling so great, so I want to wrap up. But anyway, so after f5, they played bishop d7, and then knight d5. And this is a pretty typical Maroczy situation. I think they sometimes even call this like the Maroczy knight, when it's on d5, and if you ever take the knight, you get this like really strong pawn structure, like what we saw in the first game, where white has tons of space. And if you try to just endure its presence, like with queen d8, you end up playing very passively, and that's kind of what we saw in this game. White now mounted a kingside attack with queen h4. Black couldn't tolerate the knight on d5, so they traded it. And now all this tension is favoring white. Now, if you saw my last live stream, I think it was my last live stream, you'll probably be able to guess the move here for white. So, guess the move. What do you think? How should white improve their position and attack the kingside? Yeah, Luis, I think that you have to either, in this situation, you have to either take on a4 or play b3. That's my conclusion after checking out this game. You can't just endure it forever, because the a-pawn is actually useful in restricting your queenside. Yeah, Planet Chess Club got it. Rook f3. And this is just like in the rook lift video that I just did. So if you want to see more examples of that, it's out there. I wonder if f takes g6, which is Planet Chess Club's secondary suggestion, is actually good. Because I like to maintain this tension as long as possible without letting it go. But here, there might not be any like concrete problem with it. Like, let's say they do this intuitive move, and then you play rook f3. I don't know if they have any additional defending options here as a result of this early capture, but maybe knight h7. Knight h7 might run into rook f7. Yeah, this is also interesting, maybe. And so, let's see, this clarification is try to reroute the light square bishop to g4 and then e6. Okay, if fg. Yeah, I don't think they would play f takes, though. This is definitely bad, but I think this plan that you suggested to bring the bishop to e6 could be good. I might kick it off with rook e1. Rook f3, knight d5 is not something? Okay, good question. So rook f3 happened in the game. Well, knight d5, I could at least go up a piece, right? Because bishop g5 guards c1. So I think this is fine. I don't see any tactics here, because even if you get a tempo on this bishop, I could always tuck it on g1. Not that I have to, but like, you know. Worst case scenario. Yeah, it's guarded. But you know, even if it was not even if it wasn't guarded, maybe this is still winning. It looks pretty strong. But anyway, they played knight d7 instead, trying to go for the outpost square. This is one of the ways where black tries to get counterplay in the Maroczy Bind. And after rook f1, bishop f6, rook h3, h7 is really, really weak. So they play knight f8 to guard it, and usually this knight on f8 is a really strong defending piece, but it's also passively placed. Now at this moment he took on g6, which kind of makes me wonder if it's better to wait. I mean, I do think it's better to wait, because now that you've put all this pressure on, you're kind of forcing f takes, because here if you play h takes, now you can remove the defender of h8. So I think good things do come to those who wait when it comes to clarifying the pawn structure. Yeah, definitely better. And now here there's a tactical blow for white. So I think this will be maybe my last question for you guys. What should white play here? Also, thanks for stopping in Planet Chess Club. It's good to see you here. And anybody who watches my channel, Planet Chess Club has a YouTube channel, and that probably links to his Twitch channel where he's more active. So you guys can check my recommended videos list if you want to check out his content. And here black resigned in just a couple of moves. Anand Rajan, welcome. He said bishop takes f6. This probably wins, but what's your follow-up for bishop takes f6? I think if you just snag an extra pawn, you're not necessarily like finishing it off. Luis got it. Bishop takes g6. But probably these transpose, like bishop f6, pawn f6, and then bishop g6. Hold on, I think they don't transpose, because when you take here, they could play like rook c7 maybe. I mean rook e7. Yeah, so probably it's important that you take on g6 first. Of course, if they take with the knight, we are going to give them a rapid beatdown, which is what everyone likes to see. So here we go. Let's checkmate. The smackdown. And after h takes, here we can capture on f6. But how, right? So we could take with the bishop. And after pawn takes, we could play queen h8, king f7. Probably winning. But I didn't check it because the first thing that came to my mind was rook takes. Yes, just pain. Also, welcome, Anand. Maybe a little bit late. Hopefully you can catch the first game. The first game we looked at was also very nice. And so after pawn takes, the mate is with queen h8, and then a little bit hard to find move here. So if you're watching the replay, you could pause here. And I'll just go a little slowly so you guys can think about it. But I do need to run. It's rook h7. And after knight takes, queen takes, your king is still trapped in the danger zone. So these were 2 games in the Maroczy Bind. I have a lot more, and these are all examples that I selected from Soltis's book, which is Pawn Structure Chess. It's an old book. There's no engine analysis, and yes, Plan Chess Club got it. It's an old book with no engine analysis, but I think it's extremely well put together by Soltis, and I do recommend that people read it, even if it's just to find the mistakes and use them as exercises for your training. Anyway, I probably have to run now. But it was really nice to see you guys, and I hope to see you guys next time on our live stream. So take care and good luck to everyone.